Welcome to the EpicureanFriends.com book review of A Few Days in Athens, a story about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Please keep in mind that A Few Days in Athens is fictional, and the author is giving you her own interpretation of Epicurus. In a few cases, she deviates from Epicurus's own views fairly dramatically, but when we get to those, we'll point them out to you clearly. Even more, keep in mind that the participants you're about to hear are giving their own opinions. There are many different interpretations of Epicurus, and we hope this book review will prompt you to study Epicurus for yourself. For those who want to read more about Epicurus, the book we recommend the most is Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We also invite you to join us for discussion at the EpicureanFriends.com forum and to listen to our companion podcast, Lucretius Today, which is available at all major podcast sources. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy this session, so let's join it now. Let me welcome everybody tonight to the Chapter 12 summary of A Few Days in Athens. And as usual, what we've done in the past is we'll talk just briefly about the topics that are going to be covered tonight, and then we've got a good group with us so we can have a good discussion of some of the really interesting aspects of this particular chapter. Last week was the climactic rescue of Hadia from the raging torrent of the stream, and this chapter is a follow-up on that, because the next day, I presume is when this is happening, they are having basically a celebratory banquet with some new characters being introduced for the first time. There is not a lot here about Hermarchus, but Theon meets Hermarchus, and Hermarchus observes that Theon has rescued a very special person who's specially valued to Epicurus and to the community as a whole. And then there's a series of warnings throughout the chapter that are given. Polyaenus is present in this chapter. It doesn't have an awful lot to say, but he warns Theon that he should not be intoxicated by the charms of Hadia, which is a theme throughout all of this. Now, actually, I think everything in here is pretty deep philosophy, but there's a build-up in the story that Hadia talks first about her visit to the Pythagorean school, which she was visiting at the time that she was coming back across the stream and got caught in the storm. And there's some significant discussion in here about what she observed in the Pythagorean school, and all of it, I think, consistent with an Epicurean viewpoint of how the Pythagoreans are much different than the Epicurean perspective in terms of the authority of the master of the school. And there's a lot of repartee here about the Pythagoreans being silent, obedient, and the women ignorant, modest, and stupid. And there's a lot of, like I say, back and forth wittiness where Hadia is cutting down basically the Pythagoreans for their approach to philosophy. And so that's a part of the chapter that's definitely worth talking about. But then the part that's always interested me the most, the latter part of the chapter, the focus becomes Hadia herself, I think is fair to say. And especially, I was thinking tonight about how to talk about this, especially for the audience in the early 1800s that Frances Wright was writing to. I would suspect that most women of that period would find this character of Hadia to be obnoxiously overbearing and headstrong and absolutely the opposite of the modest type of personality that they usually portray women as being desirable for women. But basically, Hadia is just very assertive and blunt. And a lot of the end of the chapter is basically sort of not in a negative way, but almost in your face. I'm cute. I'm smart. Everybody likes me. I can get my way anytime I want to. I don't need to read any philosophy books. I'm happy as I am, in a way that, like I said, I think a lot of people could find a turnoff, and maybe we'll have some of that reaction here tonight. But it's interesting that while there are warnings, Polyaenus has already given him a warning, and at the end of the chapter, Epicurus repeats the warning that Theon should not allow himself to become intoxicated by Hadia. But there's really not a condemnation that I can read of any kind against Hadia's conduct and the things that she's saying. In fact, to some extent, Epicurus agrees with some of what she's saying, and he does not call her down or criticize the presentation. So that's one of the things that I think is the most interesting about this. Is I'd be very interested in you guys' reaction to that part of Hadea's presentation, and then the lack of, again, I think a lot of people might presume that her assertiveness and her brashness would be called down. And I think there's very little of that here. Maybe there's some that I'm missing. So I'll be looking to see if you guys see that. But that is my basic summary of the major events. So if we were to follow our prior method of proceeding, we would turn it over to our color commentator, Joshua, for color as he sees fit.
Right. So when I read this chapter, what I particularly think about here is that, particularly in Attic or Athenian culture at this time, what you have is you've got the very sort of stern and serious philosophers, and they're doing their thing, but then you've got these comic playwrights who find the philosophers to be just absolutely rich food for satire. And I think a good example of that is Aristophanes and the Clouds. He's got this famous passage in which he's making fun of Socrates. Of course, the argument there is made that scene mocking Socrates may have in some way led to the trial and ultimately to his death. But there's something that we can presume, I guess, that the audiences at the places where these plays were delivered, maybe these Dionysian festivals or what have you, that the audience really sort of craved this thing. They really enjoyed a little bit of ribbing of these philosophers who all the rest of the year were basically propounding their own systems and suggesting that other people were either fools or knaves or somehow not fit for philosophy or for the life of the philosopher. These are sort of Plato's bronze men. Is that one of the metals? You've got the gold men who are supposed to be in charge, and then you've got these baser metals that are said to represent sort of the hoi polloi, the people at large. And in these festivals where the playwrights would give their would act out or deliver their plays, this is a chance, in a sense, for the hoi polloi, the people, to get one back over on them. And I think what we see in this book is a little bit of that. And so you've got this character of Hedea who is just making a mockery of the whole thing. And part of what I think that reveals about what Frances Wright thought about the Epicurean school is that they had a greater than average ability to assimilate this kind of criticism. And I think that it's probably no accident that someone like Lucian of Samosata, who was a satirist and had quite a lot of mockery for not just superstition and maybe religion as it was practiced by the people, but also for the philosopher. And then Menander, I think his work is very fragmentary, what little survives, but he does have some quotes that seem to make allusions to these very mocking allusions to philosophy. And Menander was a contemporary and apparently a friend of Epicurus. And Lucian was a great admirer, in spite of what he had to say about philosophy, of Epicurus. And I suspect that there's something there that, whether it's true in reality or not, Frances Wright seemed to be picking up on this thread that the Epicureans were less susceptible to satire and to its effects than maybe the Stoics or the Platonists or the Peripatetics. And maybe I'm just reading too much into that. But and then I've got there's this quote that I absolutely love here. I actually had to look up what a distaff was because I didn't know. But they're talking about the Pythagoreans, and Hedea says, "The wife of the good Pythagorean recommended me a distaff." Well, a distaff is a loom, or for weaving, really, and something that's very fit at that time for a woman to do. She shouldn't be engaged in philosophy. She shouldn't be going over to the Pythagoreans to talk to them about their philosophical system. She should be in the home, and she should be, weaving wool for cloths. And so she kind of makes a mockery of that as well, this idea that is the place for a woman. She thought, no, the place for a woman was to be almost the center of attention at a banquet of philosophy, where she's very ably to hold her own. I guess that's most of what I have to say about it right now. But
on that last point right there, I've always thought that there was a connotation of staff and distaff of of marriage or something, husband and wife. I'm looking around you guys, and I'm seeing a high eyebrow from Scott. But I'm looking under Merriam-Webster.com under distaff, definition of distaff, female sense.
Yeah, the distaff, or I guess I don't even know how is it pronounced distaff.
Well, I don't
The
know. I don't know whether that's correct or not either. As usual, I'm probably butchering it. But there.
in genealogy, the distaff or distaff line
Mm-hmm.
is the female line.
Right. Okay. Okay.
And
So,
and I guess the theory is that this is named after the loom.
right. Okay. So that's the source of my confusion there. It's not a reference to her getting married or
Well,
anything like that.
it might well be. That might be the
Mm-hmm.
argument here, that she needs to, find a man, settle down, and then start doing feminine things, and not holding forth at banquets. I suspect is part of this comprehensive picture here.
Kevin, is that what you're thinking?
That's what I'm thinking too. I know the staff and the distaff is, I don't know how to use them, but it's how you spin thread. And it was just the woman's role to weave and spin thread. It's what Penelope is doing for all those years Odysseus is in.
Weaving by day and then unweaving by night. Yeah.
Okay. And so the back and forth between her and Hermarchus, she's suggesting to Hermarchus that he might want to get a distaff. Yeah. And he says, I'm busy with philosophy. So yeah, there's probably a double entendre there, but the weaving aspect definitely makes sense. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I took the same thing with Hermarchus, that he's like, why don't you go do women's work? You want your socks darned? Here's a needle. But yeah, I thought that was part of the setup. The Pythagoreans who welcomed women into their schools, but not as full participants. That it would have been her job to do women.
Well, that's part of as we break down the chapter sort of into sections. We've got this first section that seems to be devoted to talking about, I guess there's a lot of this warning back and forth about maybe the seductiveness of Hadia and what is he's about to see.
It's kind of totally about the seductiveness of Hadia. What I like about it is this could be written now, right? This is entirely on you. You need the self-control. Mm-hmm. What she's doing is totally fine with us. Mm-hmm. Watch your own self, boy. Mm-hmm. Which is not what I would have expected from something written 100, 150 years ago. That's
right.
Hadia is just obviously attractive, loving it, seeking pleasure where she can find it, and it's Theon's problem to take care of himself.
What about my commentary about she's putting herself out there and taking these positions pretty assertively? Do you guys see any pushback that I'm missing that would indicate that Epicurus disapproved of her positions?
I didn't. I saw the Epicurus treating her the same way he's treated every other young person, smiling at their enthusiasm, right? Sort of. At this point in the book, I'm almost imagining him sort of thinking, oh yeah, if I were 30 years younger, I'd be running around feeling that way too.
Right. Well, towards the end of the chapter, I think it comes pretty clearly that she's making the point that she doesn't need to be studying philosophy books. Mm-hmm. And she specifically sort of addresses that to him. And it's like he doesn't push back. And of course, I think we would all take the position that he does think that it's important to be studying philosophy. But again, I want to hear what you guys think. Scott, you haven't said much yet so far. What part, if any, do you find worth picking up?
Well, I have to say first, I had to just dash through this chapter in like 5 minutes before I got on. I apologize. It's just been crazy for me. So I may be off base here and there. I was blown away by it. I'm like, what the hell is this now? Joshua's opinion on this was like, well, that sounds pretty brilliant. Maybe that's what Wright was getting at, was she was pointing this out. It was funny. I watched some couple of weeks ago or something like that. I was watching some YouTube video, and here's this gal doing this really fairy kind of a thing, sounded like Hadia, and talking about in a way, I don't know if she even talked about philosophy exactly, but about living life and being happy. It's so simple and so forth. And in a way, I had two sides to this. On the one hand, I had, like with Hadia, like, well, yeah, she's absolutely right. This is pleasure. She's living pleasure. She's not talking a bunch of trash and living in an ivory tower and so forth. Like, she's bang on, right? But on the other hand, I thought about both of them, about Hadia and about her. It sort of hit me also. Yes, you're absolutely wildly attractive, and men are attracted to you. That's absolutely a very incredibly powerful thing. It is interesting that I agree with what Joshua is saying, is that this seems to be relatively accepted. Yes, this is pleasure, this is so forth. But of course, at the same time, I feel a little bit of a smirk, a smile in Epicurus, because yes, this is a kid. You know, if she all of a sudden had all of her beauty taken away from her, oh, she wouldn't be quite so cocky, because she hasn't learned about anything of more depth than that. She can just ride on this train real easy. You know, great. If I was that beautiful, I could do it too. So I don't know what Wright was getting at, but I did think that was interesting, that the Epicureans probably have a better, you know, I can't imagine this gal doing this in the Stoic meeting. You know, really, that'd be a different conversation. You're like, no, get out of here, you little, you know.
I mean, the way she comes into the story, you know, riding her horse into a river too deep, she can't handle it, needing to be rescued. Part of this too.
Yeah.
I thought about that too, Kevin.
But it's also still true at the same time, even though she's a silly kid and she's very lucky because she's got this beauty and so forth. It's also true, and Epicureanism can recognize this, that this is pleasure, this is beautiful, this is wonderful, that humanity can experience this sort of thing. The excitement that she feels, the excitement that men feel when they encounter and so forth, these are wonderful, normal things that are laudable and wonderful, obviously if kept within some amount of, you know, control. But yeah, this is beautiful in its own way.
Well, one of the points that she makes while she's talking that I think is accurate would be where she starts talking about who would make a stranger world. Hermarchus says that she would make a strange world if she were the queen of it. But she responds that it's the philosophers who try to fit everybody into the same pattern that would make a stranger world than she would, because she says herself here that she takes people as she finds them. But it's philosophers who would fret and rub and twist and doctor everybody and try to bring everybody into the same conclusion when that's really not what nature has brought about. So that paragraph there, I think, is a particularly strong one, where she says that the philosophers would make a stranger world than she would if they were the kings of it. And then, go ahead.
Doesn't it go both ways? I mean, she's just as conceited with her perspective, and she would twist up the world in her vision.
Well, but she's specifically saying that she would not do that, Scott. The beginning of that paragraph says, for why I should take it as I found it and leave it as I found it. It says the philosophers who would doctor everybody and try to change them around. So she's taken the position that she would leave them as she found them. There again, after that paragraph, Epicurus says in response to it that I grant there's some truth, my girl, in thy nonsense. So he kind of calls it nonsense, but he grants there's to be some truth in it. And she comes back with the statement that he's one of the few philosophers who would admit that that's the case. And then she says to Epicurus that he only lacks to be a perfectly wise man, that he should burn his books of philosophy and sing a tune to the lyre. Again, she doesn't insist on that, but I found it to be an interesting perspective that there's not more of a pushback to what she's saying. And so one of the things that I've thought about in the principal doctrines that could be something that's going on here is the issue of principal doctrine 10, which is the one about how if the things that produce the pleasures of profligates could dispel the fears of the mind about the phenomena of the sky and death and its pains, and also teach the limits of desires, we should never have cause to blame them, for they would be filling themselves full with pleasures from every source and never have pain of the body or mind, which is the evil of life. So I'm not going to push that too far, but I'm wondering if there's a potential illustration here that at least in the context of what we're seeing here, Hadia was experiencing that life of pleasure. I think, Scott, you've mentioned it previously. And at that moment, at least, she's not experiencing pains that result from the way she's conducting herself. So maybe I might say that she's illustrating that even though we don't find her conduct to be particularly praiseworthy, she is, at least in her representation here, experiencing a pleasurable life. And since that is the goal of life, you have to be careful in criticizing. All right, what else?
I wonder if she and Theon are opposite sides of the same coin, right? He's looking in books and philosophy and needs to be told pleasure is okay. She's the opposite.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Right? That's why they sort of get thrown together in the story.
Yeah, yeah.
Epicurus has the same sort of avuncular attitude towards both of them that clearly wasn't happening in the Pythagorean school or the Stoics for Theon. The picture is still the Epicureans are more open to figuring it out, discovering it.
And you know, Kevin, on that point, and we'll see this next week, at this point in the story, Theon has yet to crack a book, as best I can tell. That's what we're going to talk about next week, is that he's still thinking things about Epicurus that are totally untrue as to his positions on the gods and so forth. And so even at this moment, Theon is just totally reacting to his experiences in dealing with the personalities involved, and he hasn't studied any of the doctrines that have not been just discussed with him already. So you may be right; they are sort of extremes in that respect. What about the song that she sings at the end? Joshua, I defer to you on poetry and so forth. What do you think about this song?
Oh, I'd have to read it again more carefully to be able to say anything intelligent about it.
I don't know if you've got the ability to pull it up or not while we're talking, but I think
I got the book in front of me. But
good, okay.
Right, so you've got the invocation of the Muse, just as you do in Lucretius. But come with, she says, come not in thy power with gait and garb austere, and threatening brow severe, like stern Olympus in the judgment hour, but come with looks the heart assuring, come with smiling eyes alluring, moving soft to Lydian measures, girt with graces, loves, and pleasures, bound with Basilea's zone.
Which means nothing to me.
I don't know who Basilea is.
Or her zone, yeah.
Yeah, a zone is like a belt or
okay,
like a rope that you would tie around your waist. Come, virtue, come in joyous tone. We bid thee welcome to our hearth, for well we know that thou alone canst give the purest bliss of earth. And so it's, if we're going to call upon philosophy to help us out, it's not going to be the philosophy of the Stoics, for example, all sternness and austerity and sort of dazzling eminence. It's going to be the philosophy that invites you to pleasure, and by inviting you to pleasure, also invites you to virtue.
Yeah, she introduces what she's about to sing by saying that I shall not woo my own lover, but your mistress. Because at first, when the poem starts, I'm thinking that she's like singing to Venus or Aphrodite or whatever the goddess of pleasure might be. But in the end, she starts talking about virtue. So it's almost as if she's, what is it? Again, Principal Doctrine 5, where you basically combine the two.
Right. I don't know how much Venus or Aphrodite really figured in the Greek Epicureans' view of the personification of their philosophy. Obviously, with Lucretius, slightly later we get the opening hymn to Venus, and Venus becomes kind of representative for the generative power of nature and the recombination of matter and the pursuit of pleasure. But I wonder if there was a resistance among the early Epicureans to go all in on Aphrodite or on Venus, knowing full well the connotation would not necessarily be flattering to the things they had to say.
Yeah, I don't guess there's any mention of her in the letters of Epicurus and Diogenes Laertius that I can think of.
Right. He's one of the few times I think that he actually mentions a god by name. It's Zeus, isn't it? When he says that you can rival Zeus himself for happiness. I was thinking about that the other day because we've talked a lot about Raphael's painting in the Vatican, the school of what is it called?
School of Athens.
The School of Athens, yeah, that's right. And about how to identify, which one really is Epicurus, if he's even in the painting at all. And I got thinking about this oak wreath on his head, and it didn't really make sense to me because oak in classical antiquity is almost exclusively linked to Zeus. and his famous sacred grove of oaks at Dodona, and the oracle that he had there. And then I thought of that line where it says, to be is something about, being free from cold and hunger and thirst. And he said that to be free of these things and to have confidence that you'll be free of them in the future is to rival Zeus for happiness. So I wondered if there was a connection there, but now I'm just kind of rambling. One more thing I'd like to say. There's this line about burning his books so as to not study the philosophy, but to live the philosophy. I wonder if maybe Scott knows the story I'm talking about. There's a Zen story, which I think I read in a book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. And it was about a Zen Buddhist master who passed on his collection of ancient scrolls to his disciple. And his disciple immediately takes receipt of them and then drops them onto the brazier and just burns them all. And the master's like, "What are you doing? These are ancient sacred texts, and you're just burning them." And the disciple says, "What are you doing?" And then he goes into this sort of it's a teachable moment for Buddhism and how attachment to even the texts of Buddhism can be I guess a stumbling block in one's pursuit of enlightenment. But so I guess I don't know how else to read this issue of burning the books, except to think that she thinks that the study of philosophy gets in the way of living the life that you're trying to get through philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know that story actually, or maybe I've encountered it before, but it is the old finger pointing at the moon thing. The philosophers are being accused in both cases here of, being the finger. The philosophy is the pointing finger. That's not what matters. This is a tool. This is what you're going for is the moon here. And that is the actual pleasure. That is the lived life of a certain sort. And you can get lost in your pointing at that, and you've lost the point. And the same thing with these scrolls, it's like, that's not where it's at. However wonderful they might be or clever, the point is a life well lived, is a point of a life of pleasure. And certainly that's what this chapter, I think, one of the things that it's really saying too, that Wright is saying.
Right, yeah. And that Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, it also described the famous Zen koan, or koan, however you pronounce that word, koan, as being a brick that you pick up to beat down a door, and then once you've gotten in, the brick has no more value, so you just throw it aside because, like you say, it's a tool, and it's not an end in itself.
Yeah, the same thing. Many metaphors like this from the Buddha is the raft to get across the river to get to the other side. When you get there, it's foolish to put that raft on your back and go carrying it around. It served its purpose. You got to the other side. Yeah. And so I'm hearing some echoes of that in this chapter, definitely. But what to do with that, I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't had time to really sit and digest this thing enough to really think about how pleasure is lived. I can't live pleasure the same way that this young girl can. That life is not possible to me. And I mean, just to be frank, that life is not possible. It would be wonderful to be of that, in that place and so forth. Everybody to love me as soon as they look at me and so forth, But what does that mean? It certainly doesn't mean that you can't have pleasure at various other points of your life, or that men can't have pleasure, only attractive women can, or something. But what does that mean? I mean, it's something to kind of stew about. What is living the life of pleasure? It's not just talking about it.
Right. Yeah.
I suspect part of the answer there, Scott, is just whatever it is that you do, in fact, find pleasurable. I mean, that is the point that she seems to be making in that paragraph we were talking about earlier. She's saying that she herself, from her position, would take everybody exactly as they come and not try to change them, but work with them as they are. And that it's really philosophy, certain philosophers anyway, who are making a mistake by trying to force everybody into the same pattern. Whether that's right or wrong, I think that's a fair interpretation of that section of the chapter at the end. And you've also pointed me back to Joshua earlier in the chapter, where Hediyah starts talking about why they saved her from the river. And she's joking or whatever, that it's unaccountable. Is there anything in philosophy, she's saying, that would justify people risking their lives to save her? And then she says, and I don't know who it is who answers, I'm afraid none. But then Hedea, it seems pretty clear, turns to Polyaenus and says, or in mathematics. And then she says, now just see there, we're, I think referring to Polyaenus, a proof of my argument. Can any man look more like wisdom or less like happiness? This comes of diagrams and ethics. And she says, my young Corinthian, take warning. And then Leontium, who doesn't say a lot in this chapter, agrees with Hedeias, or maybe she's looking at Hedea and says, I wish we could fix you to a diagram. And like I say, that back and forth right there is part of the same discussion, I think, of do you want everybody to be exactly the same, or do you simply take pleasure where you find it? I guess the way the diagram is not that mathematics doesn't necessarily make you happy. Can anybody look more like wisdom or less like happiness? I guess if you get happiness through diagrams, then yes, you can find happiness that way, but not everybody does.
There's a legend about Archimedes, who lived in Syracuse, which is on the island of Sicily, but it was a Greek colony, and of course a very famous mathematician and all that. And when the Romans conquered Syracuse, they had strict instructions to bring Archimedes back alive, because he had been so helpful to the Syracusan war effort against Rome. You know, he had invented these giant cranes that would hang over the water and then spear the ship and lift it up out of the water so it couldn't fight anymore. This whole legend of Greek fire and all of that. The legend goes that there's actually two different legends, but the idea that this Roman soldier sort of busted down his door, and he was very busy with his diagrams, so busy with his diagrams that even as the Roman soldier was dragging him away, he was still writing down. And then eventually he was run through with the sword while he was still transfixed by his diagrams and so oblivious to what was going on around him, because of his focus on the math. I don't know whether that reference has anything to do with what she's saying here, but
that's Archimedes, did you say?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I do think that would be relevant in the sense that Archimedes may be an example of somebody who gets so much pleasure from his diagrams that he's going to pursue that even to the very end. And I would see more proof of that argument. And again, this goes back to what Scott's talking about. There's a paragraph earlier again where Hedea is saying, and so am I with laughing at it, meaning philosophy. And then she says, my sage brother, every man thinks that is perfection, that he is himself, and that the only knowledge is that which he possesses, and that the only pleasure is that which he pursues. And I'm putting the word which in there, but I think that's the way to read it. And then she says, trust me, there are as many ways of living as there are men, and one is no more fit to lead another than a bird to lead a fish, or a fish a quadruped. That's when Marcus said she would make a strange world if she was the queen. And then she elaborates in saying, I take people as I find them. So
I missed that whole section. So I'm looking forward to going back and reading this more.
Yeah. But that's, I mean, Scott, again, as usual, I'm not trying to humor you, but you put your finger on very important issues, and I really appreciate your bringing them up to discuss them, because, you know, that's one of the big questions. Is pleasure the same for everybody? Should everybody have the same exact way of living as a way to achieve the best life? I think the implication of a lot of Epicurean philosophy is that that's not the correct approach, that people are different and need to pursue their own different paths towards a pleasurable life.
That would seem to be so. That would seem to be consistent with what I've heard, from Epicureanism. But does it also mean then that as one ages, that life becomes less possible to be pleasurable? Are we kind of taking
I would say no. I would say it's a different phase, but a different forms of pleasure are available to you.
But Hedea would say yes, and I think I think Hedea would say yes. And that's
yes, what, Kevin?
Yes, that once you get older, there's not going to be the same pleasures.
Yeah, you're just settling, and so you come up with something else that seems real pleasurable.
Epicurus seems sort of so indulgent, right? Sort of smiling at the youngster.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's the implication here that I was interested to get you guys commentary on, because I think, Kevin, a fair reading of what you just said is that you're looking at what she's saying in a negative light, that she is right, or
I'm looking at the negative light just as in a young light.
a young light.
That I think she's guilty of what she's just accused everyone else of thinking the way she sees everything is totally right.
But is she suggesting that, okay, this is one of the questions about the chapter, is this setting it up from the perspective that Hedea thinks that everyone should be like her? Does Hedea say or do anything here that implies that the fact that other people are not as beautiful or witty as she is a bad thing for them?
No, I saw a big dose of classical cynicism in her, right? Not the sort of mean-spirited modern version, the kind that just enjoys skewering everybody else's pomposity.
Now, clearly she's doing. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But she has her own, and she's sitting there being just as pompous as one could possibly be. But you're right; she doesn't overtly, say, "Oh, well, you're not as cute as me." I mean, she doesn't go after that, saying, "Therefore, you're all losers." Not directly, but indirectly, she is. She still has that youthful, "I'm invulnerable" attitude inside of herself.
I mean, she's basically implying that she's not seduced is not exactly the right word, but she's basically implying that all of these guys, including the master of the Pythagorean school and people over there, that they're all just taken in love with her because of her winsomeness.
The one, I think it's a little on from something you read, Cassius. There's a paragraph that ends, "Ah, my friends, laugh and frown, but show me the man, the wisest, the gravest, or the sourest, that a bright pair of eyes can't make a fool of."
Yeah.
Right. And of course, most of us would probably say that's probably true, but maybe Epicurus himself would be immune to that.
I wouldn't think so. And I think his candor,
You're right.
counts. I think he would say it right out there. He's like, absolutely, that's true.
You're right.
But that's what I liked so much about the chapter's whole approach to this. She's not dangerous. You are. It's your own attitudes and your own thinking and I think that comes back to part of this. It's part of her joy at her satire of the Pythagoreans and the skewering everybody, right? They're the ones sort of allowing themselves to be skewered because she does, like you were saying, she does have the power in these situations by being young and attractive and living her life the way she sees it right now. And yeah,
they don't, of course, discuss, for some reason, I don't know, maybe they do later on in the book, the weaknesses of this position.
They do not come back to this. So we're left basically with, this is Hedea and her story.
There's nothing sadder than a woman turning 30 or 35 and feeling, I'm not beautiful anymore. I mean, it's a crushing experience for many women, because that's what I am. That's what I bring to the world. And now I am nothing if I'm not beautiful. I mean, it's a really horrible thing to go through, which we ugly men don't have to suffer through as much.
Not as much. I'm not sure that it's totally gone, but it's not as much.
It's depressing. Yes. It's,
And how many times have you broken your meniscus thinking you could still play basketball?
Oh, yeah. Unless the general tone of the times was different than I'm thinking, I would think that people reading this in the early 1800s would be almost as shocked at this chapter as they might be at the religious chapters, which are about to come upon us in the conclusion of the book here. This is just not your model of womanly virtue, I would think, the 1800s to be talking about.
There's always a character like this in the Jane Austen novels, or even... Right. But it's never presented as favorably, right? There's just always the adult's consternation and the worry about how you'll get her to behave and what's her future going to be like. And here it's just, yep, this is what you're doing. We're going to listen to you talk because you can't be argued with. You're not real, right? It's a totally different attitude.
And then, of course, the chapter ends on the caution that you're talking about there, Kevin, with Epicurus again, warning Theon that Cupid is a knavish god. He can pierce the hearts of others and hold a shield before his own.
Watch out for the teaser.
Of course, I guess this too would be something that might be an echo to the end of, what is it, book 4 of Lucretius, the sex romance discussion of love in It's book 4, right, Joshua? I think it's book 4. But there's, of course, a long passage in Lucretius about that. So, I mean, clearly there was a lot of material about male-female relationships that factored into Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah, some very interesting reading there in book 4. I particularly enjoyed that episode of the podcast. I wasn't on the podcast at that time, but very interesting to listen to.
Yeah, we had Elaine with us then, I think, when we were doing that. Yeah, I mean, that is the message of the last part of chapter 4, is just not allowing the intoxication of sexual attraction to lead you down the path of disaster. So at least that message is echoed in what Epicurus and Paulinus and maybe others, even and Marcus even here, are saying. So I guess that part is there.
That's where I see the cynicism coming in also, the sexual liberties of the cynics. Right, Epicurus is not going to say they're evil in any way, just uncontrolled, right?
Well, we're about to wrap up our hour anyway. Why don't we go around and see if anybody has any additional thoughts that we haven't talked about? But before we do that, let me remind everybody, next week, let's do chapters 13 and 14 together, because 13 is very short, and I'll make some notes about this on the page, Scott. But 13 itself has virtually nothing in it. But 14 sets up the whole issue of religion and the existence of the gods and so forth. So we'll do 13 and 14 together next week. Are we still together?
Yeah.
Yep, that sounds
okay. Scott, any concluding words for tonight?
Golly, like I said, I apologize that I wasn't able to read it and try to pull some insight or two out of it. I just really didn't, but it's been wonderful, talking about it. And it's a fascinating thing. And I want us all to really be candid and think about the life of pleasure. And is it possible going forward as we age and so forth? And do we have to simply be honest about it? And perhaps it's not. I mean, perhaps that the pleasures of youth are simply not, we can't top that. That's a little bit shallow, but I mean, there's some stuff to think about there. I think that's fun and interesting.
I think it's an interesting question, but I think Epicurus was quite explicit in some regards. He seems to have said that it is not the youth which are, I don't know how he worded it, supremely happy or whatever, but those who have attained to old age. I'd have to come up with the exact.
I remember what you're talking about. Yeah, but I mean, I challenge him on that. I don't know.
I certainly understand what I think the thrust of what he was saying was that that the life of youth is very intense peaks and valleys, and kind of an emotional roller coaster, and a lot of anxiety and a lot of pressure from the outside world. But as you age, then this sort of the pressure maybe gets smaller and smaller. Of course, I don't know about that, but anyway, I just put that out there for something to think about in response to your question. You might well be on the right track, though. Of course, I don't know.
I seriously hope Joshua was right and Scott's wrong.
Yeah, me too.
It's in time.
I can argue both ends of that thing, but I think it's something to really think about. That's the greatest thing I'm getting from this, is to really dive into this. What does this mean? What is the life of pleasure? What is enjoyment? What is happiness? Blah, blah, blah. Gives me some real good new perspectives to think about.
One thing that young people sort of right after high school or right after college often realize is it becomes a lot more difficult to have meaningful relationships and to make new friends in that environment, and something that comes quite naturally to you when you're in primary school or grade school, where just the act of borrowing a crayon can make a indelible bond for life. It becomes quite a lot more difficult after the school years are over. So in that sense, that I think there is something to that, but I don't know.
Joshua, one of the lines you were from the letter to Menicius, wherefore both when young and old a man must study philosophy, that as he grows old he may be young in the blessings through the grateful recollection of what has been, and that in youth he may be old as well, since he will know no fear of what is to come. So there's a series of statements about young and old, and how happiness is still the goal for everybody.
I think in the Vatican sayings, he almost says it explicitly, though, that the people, that the older people have an easier time finding pleasure and happiness than younger people. I think he makes that claim explicitly.
There's something about a harbor somewhere. I don't know where it is, but
yeah.
Okay, it's Vatican. How about Vatican saying 17? Here we go. It is not the young man who should be thought happy, but the old man who has lived a good life. For the young man at the height of his powers is unstable and is carried this way and that by fortune like a headlong stream. Now that's kind of interesting. We've just been talking about a stream getting carried away for Hedea. But the old man has come to anchor in old age as though in port, and the good things for which before he had hardly hoped, he has brought into safe harbor in his grateful recollections. So that's Vatican saying 17. You
Yeah, blah, blah, blah. That's what Hedea would say.
You know, the analogy to being carried this way and that as by fortune like a headlong stream, that almost has to ring as potentially the inspiration for the stream episode in chapter 11.
That could very
Hedea
well
would say,
be the
hey, the
case.
stream is great. Get in it.
What is Hedea runs headlong into it. Theon tries to rescue her, and you find out at the beginning of this chapter that Epicurus waited till Theon had exhausted himself and then pulled him the rest of the way.
Yeah.
Right.
And no further
Right.
mention of the poor horse.
Right. Although the poor horse gets, I think if I was thinking about this before we started tonight, about whether she was to blame for what happened or not. I think the last chapter, to some extent, places some of the significant blame on the horse, because it talks about the horse thinking that this was a normal crossing and that the horse rushed into the stream. So there's some blame to spread around, I think, for how that happened the chapter before. All right. This has been an excellent discussion for tonight. I appreciate everybody. Thanks, everybody, for tonight. Next week, these next two chapters will be the introduction into what Epicurus's position is about the gods. So that's a pretty deep subject for next week.
Well,
Anything
there's one
else
more
for
thing.
tonight?
We know that Frances Wright was a good friend of Thomas Jefferson, and that he read this book and quite liked it. She's got one quote in this paragraph, or in this chapter is the word I'm looking for, that seems really reminiscent of some of the things that he said. She said, "Trust me, there are as many ways of living as there are men, and one is no more fit to lead another than a bird to lead a fish, or a fish a quadruped." There's a Thomas Jefferson quote that says something to the effect of, he was coming around to the idea that one generation of people, it was no more appropriate for one generation of people to establish rules for the succeeding generation than it was for one man to establish rules for another. And so there, like I say, I'm just reading a little bit of that into here, but I'd have to find the exact wording of that quote.
Interesting.
Well, one of those sections you're talking about is a section I use an awful lot in talking with some of my law stuff about the issue of the earth belongs to the living.
Yes,
And
yes.
we hold it in usufruct and not in fee simple, which doesn't have the quadruped animal examples, but it definitely talks about how one generation doesn't have a right to control another generation. But it's pretty easy to extend it to what you're talking about, Joshua. All right. Anything else, Joshua?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, we've only got a couple of sessions left, so I really appreciate everybody's participation, and we'll come back hopefully next Sunday and talk again. So thank you very much. See you next week.
All right.
Yeah.